Hi, I'm Pastor Theron. Welcome to Church Where You Are and your Wednesday Bible study. Thanks for joining me. If you like what I'm doing here on YouTube, I hope that you will consider subscribing. Thanks for tuning in. There's lots of videos to check out on the page. Our passage today comes from Matthew chapter 13 in our ongoing study of that chapter, beginning in verse 31. This is the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast. I'll be reading from the New International Version, and follow along in whatever version you like best. This is what it says. It says, He told them another parable, that being Jesus. Jesus told them another parable and said, The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all your seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and perch in its branches. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough. And Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable, and so was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth with parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. Jesus is speaking to the people in parables, and it says that he always spoke to them in parables, and I think that can be misread in a way, in that he didn't always speak to them in parables as hyperbole. He spoke a lot in parables. He tried to explain things in parables, but he didn't only speak in parables. He tried to explain things in parables, and that's what he's trying to do here. He's trying to explain the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like these different scenarios, or these different illustrations, or whatever, as he tries to explain the unexplainable. The kingdom of heaven is so vast and so misunderstood by our simple minds that Jesus takes everyday earthly things and says, oh, here's a way to connect the two. Here's a way to explain it. And in this case, he uses a tiny little seed, a mustard seed, to explain that the kingdom of heaven, he says, is like, let's say it's like a mustard seed. Mustard seed is a tiny little thing. The only ones I've ever seen are smaller than a BB. They're very small. They're smaller than a peppercorn. They're very small seeds, and yet they grow to be these great big plants. The ones I have seen look something like a rhubarb plant, if you know what that is. Big stalks, big leafy thing, and they grow to great big sizes. And he says the kingdom of heaven is like that. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Now understand that this mustard seed is planted with intention, and he has been speaking of planting, and he's been speaking of sowing. He's been speaking of sowing good seed. He's been talking about the sower. He's been talking about the soil in which the seeds fall. And now he's going to talk specifically about the seed itself. And I think it's interesting that he chose to use this particular seed and this particular plant. He says that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It starts off very, very small, but grows to great proportions. I think the first way we can look at this is to say that the kingdom of heaven is in Jesus. Jesus is thy kingdom come, thy will be done. He is he is the Son of the Father. He is the one sent from heaven. He is the first fruits of the resurrection. He is God among us. He is Emmanuel. He is thy kingdom come. So he is the kingdom of heaven. And so I think that we can look at it even from that perspective and say that the kingdom of heaven in Jesus is like this mustard seed. Had very small beginnings, very humble beginnings. In fact, Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, were poor people. Joseph was a carpenter. And when they went to the temple to offer sacrifice, they used two small birds, two turtle doves, which was the smallest tax that could be paid to the temple for, or the smallest sacrifice that could be made at the temple for the birth of a child. So it represents to the reader and to the people that they were very poor people. It was very humble beginnings. We see that Jesus grew up. He was born as an infant, born in a manger. We know the Christmas story. Born in a manger and born as an infant, born in the natural way, born of a woman. He grows up. He is a toddler. We see him at age 2 as his family escapes to Nazareth, or from to Egypt. He returns, and we find him in the temple at age 12. We see him as he enters into his public ministry at age 30. And so we just kind of assume that this baby started off very small, started off very humble, started off very meager, being born in an animal stall, grew to be this great speaker, this great leader, this rabbi, this teacher, the Messiah. He had very small, very humble beginnings, but the kingdom of heaven, as Jesus, grew to these gigantic proportions, ultimately being culminated in his crucifixion and the salvation that he offers through his death, burial, and resurrection and ascension. And even now, he sits at the right hand of God the Father, making intercession for us, because his ministry is continuing for us here on earth. Though he has ascended into heaven, the ministry continues. The work continues. The growth of the plant in this example continues, because he is still ministering to us, to the Father, for us. And this plant, if you will, this tiny beginning, grew to become this great plant, this huge plant of great proportions. And the salvation that he offers is the culmination of that very small and humble beginning. It is the salvation that he offers that is the fulfillment of this kingdom which has come, which is Christ. It is this salvation that is afforded to each of us, that God desires that none should perish, and so salvation is offered to any and all of us. And for those who would accept it, that salvation becomes another mustard seed within the life of each believer. As we receive salvation, as we say yes to the Spirit, come into my life, make me a new thing, create in me a new heart, I become a new creation with salvation. And within my heart, within my soul, within my spirit of myself and other believers, a seed is planted. This seed, like a mustard seed, like the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, he said. And in this case, in the case of salvation in the individual, salvation continues to grow if it falls on fertile soil. Now we go back and we look at some of the other parables, we can see where the seeds might fall on different kinds of soil. But when the seed falls on fertile soil, on the fertile soil of the recipient's heart, it begins to grow, it begins to blossom, it begins to emerge and to grow and become this great thing. We never arrive. Our tree just continues to grow. We are a tree planted by good water. It says in the Psalms that salvation for us, the kingdom of heaven for us, is this tiny mustard seed. And it starts off very, very small. When I first got saved, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know there was different kind of churches. I didn't know I was going to be a preacher. I didn't know I was going to teach Sunday school. I didn't know anything about going to church. It started off very, very small and humble. And that's not to say that I've grown into this great thing, but I can say that salvation has grown a great deal within me, and God has grown it and to the point where I am now. And my hope and prayer is that it will continue to grow. And my hope and prayer is that the seed of salvation will be planted in your heart and in your life, and that it will germinate and come to life and grow into this great plant, and that you will have an awesome ministry and witness and testimony, and many people will come to know the Lord by your example, by your life, by the kingdom of heaven that has grown within your life and within mine as this tiny little seed that was planted that grew to these great proportions. But not only is it the kingdom of heaven as Jesus and his humble beginnings and small things, not only is it the salvation that is within each person, but it is the salvation, I believe, of the whole world. If we look at some of the end times scriptures, eschatology theology, if you will, we read that when the whole world has been evangelized, Jesus will return. So somebody explained this to me. I think it was one of my seminary professors explained this to me one time, that if you take this disc as round, like the earth is round, salvation began with Jesus in Israel. And where did it go? Well, it went west, and it went towards Europe and into Great Britain and the First Great Awakening. And the English brought it with them to the New World. And the New World had Second Great Awakening. And people like Billy Sunday and Billy Graham and great evangelists of our time and of times past have evangelized the whole continent, the whole North American continent. South America has just absolutely exploded with salvation and with evangelistic efforts. Where was evangelism growing 20 years ago? It was going into Korea. It was growing into Africa. It was going all the way around. And now the closed countries that people are trying to evangelize with great effort and great peril to themselves are closed countries, places in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Syria. And it would seem to me that if you take the idea of this circle, that it started in Israel, went to Europe and Britain, and it went over to America, and is making its way over into Asia, and is making its way into Southwest Asia, and making its way around. And my belief is that when it starts to get back into Jerusalem, into Israel, and the Jewish people begin receiving Christ as their Savior, we will begin to see a whole new thing happening, and possibly even the fulfillment of end times prophecies. I don't know. It's just a theory of mine that somebody shared with me, and I've thought about it for a long time, and it seems to make good sense, lines up with my theology. I think that from the very small beginnings of Christianity, with Jesus teaching the disciples, and not just the 12, not just the 12 apostles, but the crowd that followed him around, the men and the women and the unnamed people in his circle of influence that began to say, hey, you ought to see what this guy is doing. And they told stories about the miracles that Jesus was performing, healing people and helping the blind to see and the lame to walk and the man with the shriveled hand. I have a whole series on Jesus miracles in the list of videos down below. Maybe you'll check them out. But as Jesus continued to perform these miracles, people would tell others about them. That's evangelism. It's just sharing the story of what you saw, what you experienced, and what happened to you in your life as Jesus moved and did his work in and through you. As these crowd of people began sharing their message, people like Paul and Barnabas and different evangelists began taking the message further and further and further out, until eventually you and I are the recipients of the good news. You and I are the benefactors of all the way back to these very humble beginnings, these very small beginnings of the evangelistic efforts of the people that followed Jesus. We benefit from the very small beginnings of this small group of people to a global, worldwide body of believers who is now the Christians, the Christian church. The people of Christ is not a particular denomination. It is the global, worldwide body of believers. Anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved, and anyone who has called upon the name of the Lord is a Christian. And from those small beginnings, the seed of a mustard seed has grown into what it is today. So Jesus is the kingdom come. The salvation that he offers has very small beginnings in the life of the individual. It has global implications from the small beginnings of the few that follow Jesus. And I think that maybe we could take it a step further and say that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed in the work that we do, the efforts that we put forward, the dreams that we have, the gifts that we live within each of us that God intends for us to use for His glory, to share the gospel with the world, as I just mentioned. The work that you put in starts off with a very small beginning. But the Bible says in Zechariah, do not despise the day of small beginnings, because these are the days that grow and they develop, and we may not see it. Just like the mustard seed first planted in the soil begins to do its work. The moisture in the ground begins to do its work. God, in His mystery, begins to do His work, and the seed begins to swell and to open and to germinate, and a small plant miraculously and mysteriously begins to emerge from the ground. And I think that that's why these two parables are merged, because they're things done in secret. There's things done in mystery. They're things that are unseen, that develop in a way that we don't really understand. They develop in a way that we can't completely comprehend. We don't see it happening. We can't measure how it happens, but it still happens in mystery and in secret. When the seed is planted in the ground, it begins to develop in a way we don't always see. And so the seed begins to poke up through the soil, and it eventually grows to this gigantic plant. Well, yeast works through a whole batch of dough. He says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. And what I think he means by that is it has a very small beginning sometimes, and it grows to be this great and wonderful thing. It grows to be this giant plant, or what represents this giant plant. And again, he's trying to explain the unexplainable using words. And our language just does not capture the fullness of what the kingdom of heaven is really like. But he says, the kingdom of heaven, it's kind of like a mustard seed. It's planted in the ground. We don't see it as it begins to do its mysterious work, as God begins to do His mysterious work through it, and yet it grows into this great big plant. The kingdom of heaven is kind of like that. But it's also kind of like yeast, that a woman works through a whole batch of flour. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough. Now, yeast is an amazing thing. It works through the whole batch of dough. Yeast helps the bread to swell and to grow and to rise. It works through the whole batch of dough, the Bible says. Yeast is usually represented as something bad that grows, and yet here we have it as something good, that it's developing, and in the kingdom of heaven is like this. And I think that what he's saying is that the kingdom of heaven starts off small like the mustard seed, but it also starts off kind of unseen, and you don't see the mysterious work that's taking place within the flour, within the dough. You see the result of it, and the result of it is this really wonderful bread, and so many of us love our hot bread and butter, and so you have this yeast that's doing its magic work, its mysterious work, its God-intended work, and it works through the whole batch of dough. It doesn't just affect a small part of it. It affects the whole thing. But it does so mysteriously. It does so unseen. It does so in a way that we can't necessarily measure or visually see, but we can see the results of it. And the kingdom of heaven is kind of like that. But I wonder, and I'm concerned, that the yeast that we work in our lives can also be bad, as yeast is usually represents something bad or evil that takes place in a person's life, or Jesus refers to the yeast of the Pharisees as being something bad. But I would hope and pray that the yeast that is developing within your life, that is working through the whole batch of dough that could represent your life or your work, or whatever you happen to be doing, or thinking, or the way you're living, or the way you're developing and growing, or the ideas and plans that you have, as the yeast begins to develop, if it's not done right, it can be the evil and the wickedness continue to grow. And we have to be cautious of that. What kind of flour, what kind of dough are you growing? What kind of plant are you growing? Are you growing seeds of goodness? Are you growing seeds of righteousness? Are you growing seeds of positivity? Or are you growing negativity? Are you growing wickedness? Are you growing evil? The choice is yours. You have to strive. We we say all the time, I'm not perfect, I'm just forgiven, but we should be striving for the perfection that is Christ. The Bible tells us to be holy as God is holy. I like to change the word and say perfect. We never obtain it. Be perfect as God is perfect. That's not something that I can do apart from Him. It's not something that I can even do, but I'm going to strive for it. And I hope that you will too. I hope that everyone that we come into contact with is the opportunity to hear this gospel message, to have a mustard seed planted in their life, to have yeast work through the whole batch of dough that is their life, or their plans, or their work, or their efforts, your family, your household, your property, the efforts that you're putting in, your dreams, your gift that you are striving to make a reality. It starts with small beginnings. It starts like a tiny mustard seed. Don't despise the day of small beginnings, but let it germinate and do its mysterious work and grow and become this huge and wonderful plant, not only in your life, but in the lives of others as you share this message, in the work and the efforts that you put forth in your day-to-day efforts and work and process. Continue to do good things. Don't grow weary in well-doing, but always striving forward and looking for the positive, looking for the good results, looking for the righteousness. That the kingdom of heaven is right there in front of us and lives within us, and that we are the benefactors of these things. Thanks for watching.